up. Hello, everybody. It's not morning for all of you, I understand, but anyway, great to meet you in this way too. Well, you have all heard me talk about and reminding you about the presence of this evaluation, and I'm really glad for this opportunity to share the lessons learned and to discuss it with you. This has been important and continues to be important to Sida, and there will be a process going on afterwards also, which I'll let you know about towards the end. I just wanted to say a little bit about the background to this evaluation. Can you hear me properly?
I can hear you very well, Gun. I hope everyone else can.
Thank you very much. Well, there are really two entry points for this evaluation. The first is the market systems development approach, which is a well-established approach within Sida, and you know that I'm coordinating a network of colleagues throughout the organization, working with employment and market development, private sector development broadly. And the MSD approach is one of the areas we prioritize within this network. There has also been a growing recognition and interest of the approach, and a feeling that there is a growing number of interventions. We do have some good practice also, and there is an expressed interest among program officers to expand it into new areas. This has also implied that there is an increased demand for learning and capacity and developing our ways of working with this. There's a need for knowledge not of the MSD approach as such, but in particular a growing demand for how we can work to manage programs adopting this approach in a better way. In fact, we have lacked an overview both what we are doing and how we are doing as regards the MSD approach and its management. And the feeling has been that we are working on this in a very ad hoc manner and that we have no systematic approach for how to manage this. And so this has led, of course, to the desire to learn more about and develop our ways of managing this approach. So we have wanted to focus precisely this evaluation on how to manage the MSD approach. And we also wanted to include a large part of the network and others in the process and to make it a learning evaluation, to draw on experience and also to have people participate in the process. To facilitate our continued work. Now, so the MSD approach has been, and our way of working has been one of this entry point, but there's also been another entry point, which is related to the broader doing development differently agenda, or particular aspects maybe of adaptive management and more systemic approaches. And that is sort of a perspective and an agenda that has emerged among us donors, but also within Sida, and an approach that, or an agenda that recognizes the complexity and uncertainty of any social development, development cooperation in particular maybe, and not least market development. Maybe it's even more expressed there. Complexity, uncertainty, also the importance of local ownership and adaptive management, an organic process of change, and how to deal with that. So within Sida, there's also been an interest in these issues on looking at how we manage development cooperation more broadly. But it's a spread interest within the organization that has grown a little bit in recent years, and there's sort of an appetite for learning more about this. And you could also say that it has, to some extent, this agenda influenced some of Sida's processes. We have, for example, a contribution management system, we call it, and it is reflected in the new system, but it hasn't really been applied in practice. We also have manuals for results-based management and evaluation, which I think capture part of this. And we have a very new vision that stresses the focus on poverty reduction, which also provides a little bit of ample, how shall I say, or fertile ground for this work. But Sida's actual practice doing development is not so much, has not so much changed as sort of the intentions and understandings. So this is another entry point. And so there have been ongoing discussions with people, between people, both within the network that I coordinate and we who work with MSD in particular, and those interested in these more broader changes in development. And for a time period, the evaluation team and we were in the same unit, and so we started seeing a joint interest here. And so we started formulating a task for this evaluation. And it was proposed to Sida's management and the Director General to be a strategic evaluation, which is a new concept, but it has sort of applicability and relevance to the entire Sida organization. And it was approved as such. And this evaluation then has two major purposes. One is to learn from experience of us and others how we can improve our management and thus our practices of promoting programs that apply the MSD approach. The other main purpose is to learn lessons or discuss implications for what this may imply for adaptive management and systemic approaches and the DDD agenda being applied within Sida more broadly. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Gun. And just to introduce myself, my name is Tim Ruffer. I'm a director at Itad, and I was also the team leader for the evaluation that we're discussing today. I'm also joined on the line by another team member, Helen Bailey, and there are a few others doing this. I'm going to talk through as I change slides because I know some of you don't have the screen in front of you. So just going on to the first slide, the structure. I'm going to quickly talk through the rationale and context of the evaluation, although Gun's already given a useful introduction to that. And then spend most of the time before we move into discussion to set out the key findings and lessons for the evaluation. I think the plan is to have some discussion after I've presented those, and then we'll come back to talking through the 6 recommendations that we've provided at the end. Moving on to the purpose of the evaluation, as has been said, really there were 2 parts to the purpose. The first is to contribute to improved programming by Sida in the area of market systems development. And the second is to look at what the implications are of our findings, looking at market systems development for Sida's wider programming, and particularly programming that applies an adaptive approach or systems-based approach. It was a little bit unusual as an evaluation because what we did not evaluate the effectiveness of Sida's market systems development programs per se. What we very much focused on was Sida's management of those programs and the interaction between Sida and its implementing partners. Although, of course, in doing that, we did start to touch on findings or implications in terms of effectiveness. Moving on to the next slide. What we were asked to do at the start of the evaluation was to compare the market systems development approach with traditional development programming, if you like, very much accepting that these are real typecasts, if you like, and it was quite difficult. But I think making the contrast was helpful in looking at, well, what is it that is different about the market systems development approach, and then using that to draw conclusions for what that implies for donors. And I'm sure that most of these are quite familiar to participants, but I'll run through them quickly anyway. Traditional development approach is characterized by direct delivery, essentially identifying a problem and coming in and addressing that directly. So, for example, if smallholder farmers are unable to access finance to pay for inputs, then a traditional approach might be to come in and fund organisations to provide that credit directly to farmers. By contrast, the MSD approach takes the role of a facilitator, tries to stay outside of the market system and facilitate permanent actors within the system to act in different ways. Traditional development programming, what we've called ex ante design and control. So that is really in its most stark form that we come in, we know what a problem is, we define a solution at the start of a project and design our project around that solution with fairly fixed plan and set of indicators for success. Whereas the MSD approach very much accepts that, first of all, we will always start with imperfect knowledge, and secondly, that the context within which we work is constantly changing and adapting, and that we need to adapt in response to those changes, but also in response to what we learn as we go along. And third distinction between traditional and MSD is that traditional approaches tend to focus on particular actors within a market system, engage with them and assess success by the degree to which those actors have changed their behaviours or delivered results. Whereas the MSD approach looks at the wider market system and the whole sort of ecosystem of actors that operate within them. So that distinction, and very much accepting that it is sort of characterising in many cases two extremes, was helpful nevertheless in the way that we framed our evaluation. And as Gordon said, Sida selected the MSD approach partly as a case study for what Sida can learn about its development programming more generally. And in thinking that through, we believe anyway that the market systems development approach as a case study does have many commonalities with the wider doing development differently agenda. And those three characteristics of facilitation, adaptation and market systems do map very closely with three important aspects of the doing development differently agenda around engaging broad sets of local agents and working with them in a politically smart manner, accepting uncertainty and adapting, and really importantly, taking account of local context and systems. So that provides the starting point. The other interesting thing, at the start of the evaluation, we tried to map out Sida's MSD programming over the past couple of decades, and it was a bit of a challenge because Sida hadn't sort of systematically mapped its MSD programming, but we identified, I think it's about 35 or so different projects that have been in existence since 1999. And what's really stark here is that there's been a real significant surge in MSD programming, particularly since around 2013-14. And now I think there's about 20 odd MSD programs. 27. Gun's better at counting than me. 27 MSD programs in existence at the moment. So for that reason, a really relevant evaluation for Sida. And we picked 11 of the projects on this list as case studies and looked at those to inform our findings. I'm going to start with the conclusions and then go into the detail, and I'm just going to read these out. This is our sort of our very short executive summary of what we found. So Sida's role in the management of projects it funds is an important determinant of the effectiveness of Swedish aid. And although progress is being made, the evaluation identified several factors that affect Sida's ability to ensure that the optimal conditions are in place for effective MSD and good development programming more generally. Sida has a relatively flexible framework of rules and guidelines and systems for project management, and that does provide the space needed for innovation and adaptation. But we did find that for that to happen consistently and effectively within that fairly open and flexible framework, it's really important that Sida invests more deliberately in building the capacity of its staff to do so, and often that was lacking, and very much something that Sida staff themselves flagged. But it's not just about capacity. We believe that leadership and incentives play a really key role within an organisation like Sida to shape a culture of experimentation and learning and taking risks. And beyond that, that clearer guidance is needed. And that guidance shouldn't be something that limits the way that Sida staff can innovate and change, but it needs to be there to provide them with the confidence and a consistent framework to operate within. And another thing that we found was that whilst adaptive management by a donor requires providing space to implementers, Sida does need more effective ways to sort of oversee the performance within that space, and when things really are not going according to plan, to have the tools to enable it to hold those implementers to account. And we found quite a number of examples of where Sida program staff knew that things were not going well, but were a little bit at a loss to know what to do about it. So moving on to the next slide, the adaptive triangle, and this is something, a concept that we've developed within Itad. Often we talk about adaptive management and adaptive programming and mix up these terms without necessarily clarity about what we mean by them. And so what we've done here is defined adaptation in terms of development programming in three corners of the triangle. So we have adaptive delivery, which is what we define as frontline staff who are actually out there thinking on their feet and making day-to-day decisions in testing and correcting and engaging with participants within the market system. We then have adaptive programming, which is a more slow and deliberate and structured process of reflection, analysis, and setting new programming directions, which often and generally happens within the program, but may engage donor staff. And importantly, it's adaptive management. This is where donors really come in and have an important role to play in contributing to effective program adaptation. And that's around the way that they design, procure, fund, and manage programs. And it's really that we focus on within the evaluation, the role that Sida plays in adaptive management, and thereby in enabling adaptive programming and adaptive delivery to operate effectively. The other thing that or lens that we use is when we talk about Sida's management or organisational capacity, we broke that down into three areas. First of all, are the formal rules or guidelines or systems that define the way that Sida operates and manages its funding. But very much recognising that rules and guidelines alone are not what defines behaviour. Behaviour is also very strongly influenced by both organisational culture and capacity of Sida staff. So we looked at all three of those things when we looked at Sida's management. So just to talk through our findings and lessons, what I've done is divided those into 4 areas where I think probably there's some main findings came out. Those relate to design and appraisal of project design and the role that Sida plays in that. Importantly, results-based management and evaluation, and we'll come on to talking about how that's particularly important for MSD and other adaptive programs. The way in which Sida thirdly identifies and manages its implementing partners, and then fourthly a wider set of issues around leadership, incentives and capacity. Moving on to the design and appraisal slide. I think some of the key findings were that whilst there were, across our case studies, we did identify some a good number of well-designed projects. That there was a number of common weaknesses across a number of them, not all of them. There were a significant number of cases where project design was not based on what we felt was strong analysis, or where detailed design had happened ahead of detailed analysis. That's important, I think, to recognise that a project initiation can often begin and should begin before detailed analysis has been undertaken, but where that is the case, it's necessary and desirable for design to be relatively open and flexible. Secondly, quite a lot of projects with fairly short timeframes of 2 to 3 years. So again, this wasn't always the case, but there are a significant number of them, which we found, unsurprisingly, didn't really provide enough time for the sort of type of change at a systemic level that would be intended by a market systems program. And finally, in a number of cases, quite detailed pre-commitment of funds to particular activities or interventions, which led to an undermined flexibility further down the line as context changed and programs wished to adapt. Sida has a quality assurance system for its design. It's called appraisal, which happens before funding is signed off, and that's quite a formalised process which involves a number of different people within the embassy and at headquarters, normally including the head of development cooperation, and legal and other teams, as well as the programme officer who's involved in it. And we looked quite carefully at that appraisal process. And what we found is that many of the factors that are widely considered to be core and desirable within MSD project design were often questioned during the appraisal process. And that's things like the lack of detailed activity plans being criticised, that results frameworks were not detailed enough at the design phase, or again that funding hadn't been committed in a specific enough manner. And that often, at best, led to a pretty difficult time for the programme officer to get things through, a lot of dialogue and time spent in engaging those who are not familiar with the approach, at best. And at worst led to designs actually going backwards during the appraisal process. And another thing that we identified was that in the appraisal of implementing partners, historically there's been a very strong focus on minimising risk, so looking at anti-corruption and fiduciary risk. And the focus was very much on that, rather than assessing the relevant capacity of implementers to do market systems development effectively. And a lot of that comes down to partly experience, but also mindset and culture, I think, around capacity to pilot, to experiment, and to take managed risks. And that applied both to organisations but also team members. We felt that the appraisal was often focused on the wrong things. So the lessons coming out of that, first of all, that we feel that for market systems or other projects, the appraisal really needs to more explicitly consider the requirements that are set up for good market system development programming, that a more standardised appraisal process which is focused on minimising risk is not really appropriate within this context. And importantly, leadership within Sida has a really key role to play in defining those considerations and setting up an appraisal process that is tailored to the approach. And it also does require capacity, not detailed understanding of market systems development, but some sort of capacity and understanding amongst those involved in appraisal and quality assurance of what makes good programming and good design in this sort of context. There was a lot of focus on results-based management and evaluation within our evaluation, and that is because it is absolutely key to good market systems development and adaptive programming more generally. We found that the DCED standard as a well-established good practice in results-based management and MSD was sort of, I think in a number of programs mentioned as an approach that a program sought to follow, but had not really been used proactively, and certainly was not, a lot of the good practice around that of defining results chains and continually testing them and defining indicators based on those results chains was not something that we saw as being commonly applied across the portfolio. And as I mentioned before, examples of where very detailed results frameworks in terms of indicators have been developed before detailed market analysis or a really detailed theory for interventions have been defined. A bit of confusion amongst a number of implementing partners about really what it was that they were required to report to Sida, and a lot of sort of second guessing and backwards and forwards on that, which led to inefficiencies at best. And I think on the part of Sida program officers, often uncertainty themselves on what kind of results it was that they wanted to be reported to, what role they played in results-based management within the program, and how that relationship should work effectively. And a lot of that came down to the next point of a lack of training or guidance or experience in results-based management amongst Sida personnel. And finally, whilst I think for most of the, if not all of the projects that we looked at, evaluation was envisaged at some point in the program cycle, it wasn't really used as effectively as it could to inform course correction and learning. It was often something that was sort of rushed in at the last minute because of an arbitrary timetable that had been set, and often funding decisions or changes in program strategy took place out of sync with those evaluation results, which was a wasted opportunity where that happened. So the sort of key lessons that came out of that, we feel that mainstreaming the application of the DCED standard or other similar approaches to results-based management would really benefit Sida's market systems portfolio. That Sida needs to be clearer on what it requires in terms of results definition and reporting for its market systems programs, and that's particularly around ensuring that projects are incentivized in the right way and held to account as much as anything for long-term sustainable change rather than short-term quick and easy results, which we saw was sometimes the case. And that Sida really does need to start to use its external evaluations more effectively. So making firm commitments to evaluation and integrating those into project planning and ensuring that they are funded adequately. The identification and management of implementing partners is, of course, absolutely key to the success of a project. We found this in many cases in the context in which Sida was working. It had found it challenging to find suitably qualified implementers. There were a good number of examples of where it had got around those challenges in a number of different ways. I think next, that sort of relationship between Sida and the implementing partner. Again, we found some very good examples of where that had worked effectively, and where it had worked effectively, that engagement was based on a sort of open and constructive dialogue, and a sort of fairly informal relationship around being open about failure and success and challenges and what needed to change through the project life cycle. There were a number of cases where implementers, in terms of how that relationship should work, were a bit unclear on where they had flexibility to change, where they did not, at what points they should or shouldn't engage with Sida, and the extent to which that was a sort of formalised reporting relationship or one of more informal dialogue and learning. And I think finally there's a little bit of a sort of a challenge or a trade-off here, I think, for a funder. But it is important to sort of find that balance between a sort of a constructive relationship that's based on open dialogue and learning, but at the same time, when things really are not going effectively, and Sida staff are concerned that after a long period of effort that an implementing partner is not performing well, it does need to have some sort of form of sanction in order to address that. And again, there were a good number of instances where I think Sida programme staff felt at a bit of a loss of what to do when things were not going well. So coming back to the appraisal process, that in selecting an implementing partner, looking at that capability for market system development really ought to be primary consideration. Sorry, Gunn's just, yes. I've said it, Gunn.
Okay, sorry for intervening, yeah.
That relationship is really critical, and understanding how Sida can encourage and support a learning culture is something that does require capacity and experience, and I think sort of sharing of good practice amongst Sida staff. Sida needs to be more clear with its implementers on the points at which engagement or approval is needed, and that there are ways in which Sida's funding agreements or contracts could be adjusted to ensure that incentives for the right form or most effective form of delivery are strengthened. And finally, something that cut across most of our evaluation findings was firstly the important role of leadership and incentives within the organisation. Part of this can be addressed through changes to rules and guidelines, but good market systems development management by Sida requires quite different behaviours on the part of the funder compared to more traditional development programming. And to embed that culturally and to achieve a culture of risk-taking and learning from failure really does require that leadership plays a role, first of all, in demonstrating and acting in that way itself, but also at particular points in the program cycle, for example, in appraisal, in sort of setting the context for consideration of project designs to ensure that MSD considerations are encouraged. That sort of wider culture of learning and adaptation is built into country strategies explicitly, and also ensuring that the required organisational and staff capacities are invested in by Sida. And we provided some specific views within the evaluation findings on areas in which Sida should invest in relevant capacity, but I won't go into those now. So, Mike, I'm going to pause there and hand back over to you and two participants.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. Actually, it's really just one slide remaining on the recommendations here, and I've just, for the purposes of this presentation, just pulled out the headlines here, but there's more detail in the report to Sida on specifically what we're suggesting. But we've essentially cut our recommendations into three down the left around what Sida might do to address organisational culture, capacity, and then rules, guidelines and systems. So very much accepting that there's some overlap. A couple of our recommendations 2 and 5, are quite specific to market systems development, but the remainder of them are actually of wider relevance, we believe, to general programming. And I think this comes back a little bit to the point that I was making a moment ago, that actually a lot of the findings that came out, whilst the evaluation was quite focused on the market systems approach, and we admittedly don't have a strong sort of evidence base to say with full certainty that these findings are more widely applicable. Our discussions with Sida staff during the evaluation have suggested that they are. So with encouragement from Gun, we've stuck our necks out a bit and made a lot of our sort of recommendations at a much more general level, particularly because these recommendations are going up to the Director General and will require a response from her. And so sort of tactically we feel that they're more likely to gain traction at this more general level. The first recommendation is probably the one that we found hardest to sort of pin down specifically, but I felt it was really important to make it to leadership within Sida and for them to think about it and consider what this implies. But as we see here, that leadership really does have a role to play in supporting and incentivizing experimentation, learning, adaptation. And that if Sida really does recognise the value of doing development differently, then leadership does need to explicitly and consistently endorse that and provide incentives for staff to do so as well. And that can come in quite a number of different ways, through the way in which they engage and set up appraisal processes, through staff performance management and the extent to which staff are rewarded for learning and for encouraging robust analysis for the right sort of constructive relationships with implementing partners. But I think also it comes down to the way that leadership sort of communicates the importance of results and learning, how these sorts of things are built into Sida's country strategies, and a range of other things. So in that recommendation, we've given some examples of what this might look like without being too specific, because it is such a broad recommendation. The second one is essentially around Sida's institutional capacity in market systems development. And Gun, over the past few years, has put a huge amount of effort and energy into coordinating the network for employment and market development, but has been incredibly resource constrained in doing that, and that beyond that
virtual network. The sort of central institutional support within Stockholm for the application of the approach is relatively scattered and under-resourced, and we feel that to drive forward lots of the other recommendations and findings, that some investment is required institutionally by Sida. Staff capacity.
Tim, you're just a little bit quiet or muffled. I don't know if you're covering the microphone or something.
I'm sorry, my head was drifting away from my laptop. Can you hear me better now, Mike?
Yeah, that sounds a bit better. Thank you.
Good, good. On staff capacity, there's a range of things here, but I think essentially this is around ensuring, specifically to market systems, that Sida's market systems experts have the right resources, training, knowledge sharing, etc., to enable them to do their jobs effectively. And a lot of that is partly about having the right guidance and technical skills, but a lot of it is about having the right support from colleagues and sort of confidence to go about good market systems programming. I think sort of internal networks around peer learning and coaching, and potentially external backstopping support or help desks for Sida, and also, Jim, as you mentioned, the sort of resources that are available from DCED and Beam Exchange all play a role. But as I said, it's not just about that capacity amongst Sida's market systems experts. A sort of broader understanding and capability around adaptive management within Sida is important. And as I mentioned, I think that Sida has made some really positive steps just in the last few months around the guidance and changes to its project management system that provide a stronger framework for adaptive management, but capacity needs to accompany systems. The fourth recommendation is a general one. It's around just systematizing learning more, institutionalizing learning more strongly within Sida, both at project level, but also at the country level. And for both projects and for country strategies, setting out timetables, I think it probably needs to be quite done fairly formally to ensure that it happens for learning. And so that's for both projects and country strategies, identifying up front what the key learning themes are, identifying what sort of evidence and analysis and resources are required to answer those questions, and then developing fairly clear mechanisms for that learning to happen and feed into adaptation. The fifth one is around developing guidelines for MSD project management. There are lots of really good guidelines that exist, but we feel that it would be helpful for Sida internally for those to be specifically tailored to Sida's own systems. And actually, we saw a really good example of something similar that has been done at SDC and referred to and looked at that actually as we developed this recommendation. So I won't go into that in any further detail now, but we did provide some suggestions of how that might be structured in our evaluation report. And then the final one is around contracts and funding agreements. And I think there's a number of things there. First of all, making it more explicitly clear within those contracts and funding agreements which areas are sort of fixed within a contract and relatively inflexible. And we feel that there shouldn't be much that's fixed and inflexible, but perhaps a few things around the sort of overall very high level objectives of a project and the sort of approach and behaviours that are expected of the implementer. Being clear then on which areas are subject to adjustment but with approval from Sida, and that might be very significant changes to project strategy or geography or value chain.
for example. And then being quite clear to the implementer on areas where it is able to get on with adaptive programming on itself without interference or need for sign-off from Sida, and that is not clear at the moment on the majority of Sida projects. And then finally, and I must emphasise that this is sort of a last resort, but as I say, we did identify instances where projects were really not going well and where Sida felt at a bit of a loss as to what to do about that. And so providing within contracts some sort of form of resort to special measures or sort of formalised performance reviews where absolutely required. And I think also, and there are examples from other funders of doing this, what we identified in a number of appraisals was that because of risks that were identified with a project, project timelines were cut short, and that was seen as a way of managing risk and ways in terms of implemented performance. And our suggestion is that that's not the way to go, that longer project timeframes are desirable, but that break clauses could be built in at particular points in the project to enable Sida to manage that risk so that at certain points, like the end of the inception phase or midway through, a formalised review of project performance, which provides Sida with sort of clear sanctions if things really are going badly, ideally accompanied by evaluations, which happen a little bit ad hoc at the moment, but just sort of improving at that process would actually, we would hope and think, enable implementers with greater freedom to get on and do good programming over a longer period of time, whilst providing Sida with the sort of tools to let that happen, but to step in as and when absolutely necessary where things are not going well. So yeah, those are our 6 recommendations, Mike. I'll stop there.